Hello guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about 5 reasons why your glutes aren't growing. So if you're trying to grow a juicy booty and you're tired of spinning your wheels, you feel like you've tried every trick in the book and every fitness influencer's workout guide and you're still not seeing progress, this video is for you. So let's get into it. So number 1 is that you're doing too much cardio and you're not eating enough. If you want to build muscle, you have to be at least at calorie maintenance or preferably in a small surplus, which means you have to be eating at least as many calories as you're burning or even a little bit more for your body to have enough energy to build muscle. So if you're doing a ton of high intensity cardio, you're burning off a bunch of energy that your body could be using towards your strength training workouts and towards building muscle. And then on top of that, if you're not eating enough calories, the same thing happens. Your body doesn't have enough energy to put towards muscle building. So a common problem I see is that people are afraid to eat more because they don't want to gain weight. But if you're building muscle, you're going to be gaining weight. Muscle has weight to it. So if your weight's not going up, that means you're probably not building muscle. So don't be afraid to see the scale go up. Don't be afraid to eat and fuel your body with the calories that it needs if muscle building is your goal. And then on top of just calorie needs, you also want to make sure you're getting adequate protein intake because protein is the building blocks of muscle. I recommend about 2.2 to 2.4 grams of protein per kilogram of lean body mass, which would be your total weight minus your body fat. So if you don't have a way to measure your body fat percentage, you can estimate it. There's images you can find online of what different body percentages look like. So if we take this as an example, say you're 150 pounds and you estimate you're at about 20% body fat. We're going to take your pounds and convert it to kilograms, so that would be 68. We're going to multiply that by 0.8 because we're subtracting the 20% body fat, which gives you 54 kilograms of lean mass, and then you multiply that by 2.2, so you should be eating at least 120 grams of protein every day. And the last thing to keep in mind in terms of your nutrition is carbs. So carbohydrates are your muscle's main source of energy. So if you're strength training and you're trying to build muscle, you need to make sure you're eating enough carbs, not just throughout the day, but also before your workouts. I recommend having a meal that is high in carbs so that your muscles have the energy they need to perform that workout. Number 2 is that you're not choosing effective exercises. So your glutes have 3 main muscles, the glute maximus, medius, and minimus. The minimus is a small stabilizer muscle, so it's not going to add a whole lot of size to your glutes. So we want to focus on targeting your glute max and your glute medius. The glute maximus main function is to extend your hips. The glute maximus main function is to extend your hips. So in targeting that, we want to do exercises that focus on glute extension, like RDLs and hip thrusts. The glute medius main function is to abduct the hip or move your leg away from your body, but it does this best when your hips are extended. So a seated hip abduction is not going to be best for targeting this muscle. We want to focus on things like glute medius kickbacks or standing hip abductions. The other thing to keep in mind when it comes to exercise selection is that lengthened bias exercises or exercises that are hardest when your muscle is stretched are going to be slightly more effective for hypertrophy than shortened bias exercises. So an example of a lengthened bias exercise would be an RDL. That's going to be hardest at the bottom when your glutes are stretched. And then a shortened bias exercise is something like a hip thrust that's hardest at the top when your glutes are contracted. So I hear people say all the time, oh, this workout is so great for growing your glutes. It gave me a great pump. The thing is, pump is not an accurate representation of whether an exercise is effective at growing your muscles or not. So shortened bias exercises actually create more of a pump, but they're not as effective at building muscle as the lengthened bias exercises. So don't just focus on what gives you the best pump when you're picking your exercises. You want to pick those big movements that add a lot of load, they're stable, and they're targeting the muscle in the lengthened position. Now we do still want to incorporate some shortened movements as well because the lengthened bias exercises do cause more damage to your muscles. So if you only do them, it is going to be harder to recover from. And for functionality, it's good to hit the muscle through its entire range of motion. The last thing I wanted to talk about in this section is the glute band. This is something that you see a lot, people adding the band around their legs when doing exercises like squats and hip thrusts. So remember when we talked about the different muscles in your glutes? An exercise like a squat and a hip thrust is targeting the glute maximus, which does hip extension. Putting a band around your knees is causing you to have to push your knees out, which is not an action of the glute maximus. So you're not adding anything to the exercise in terms of glute max stimulation by adding that band. So all that's gonna do is make it so that you have to use less weight and actually decrease the stimulus on your glute max, which is the muscle that you were targeting. So you're much better off getting rid of the glute band and just adding more weight, and then training your glute medius separately. So number 3 is that you don't have a structured plan. So if you find yourself just kind of winging it when you go into the gym and doing whatever you feel like that day, or finding some random workout on Instagram to follow, you're not going to be able to track your progress and implement progressive overload. Progressive overload is the process of increasing the intensity and difficulty of your workouts over time, and it's essential for muscle growth. So if you're doing random workouts every week, and so one week you do an RDL, and the next week you do a hip thrust, and the next week you do leg press, there's no way for you to tell if you're actually increasing the weight and intensity because the exercises are different. Versus if you do an RDL every week for 4 weeks, you can make sure you're increasing the weight on that exercise week after week, making it more difficult and stimulating muscle growth. Number 4 is that you are neglecting form and execution. This is super important if you want to actually see progress and make sure that your workouts are effective. You need to make sure that your form is on point. Not only is that going to help you reduce the risk of injury, but it's also going to make sure that those exercises are actually doing what you want them to do. So a few things to keep in mind is you always want to have a neutral spine, meaning from the top of your head to your tailbone should always be in a straight line when you're performing exercises. And you want to always go back to those intended actions that we talked about. So the glute max for hip extension and the glute medius for hip abduction. Make sure that you're focusing on those motions when you're performing the exercise to make sure you're targeting the glute muscle. One other thing to keep in mind when it comes to form, and it also ties back into exercise selection, is that your hamstrings also perform hip extension. So if you want to target your glutes over your hamstrings, you want to have a little bit more knee bend. The reason is the more bend you have in your knees, the less leverage your hamstrings have to perform the motion, which means it's going to transfer more of that tension onto your glute muscles. In addition to your form, you also want to focus on your tempo, which is the speed that you perform each exercise. So you want to make sure that you're always controlling the eccentric or the lowering portion of the exercise to create more tension on the muscle and stimulate more growth. So if you're just swinging the weight around with no control, you're using a lot of momentum and you're not creating enough tension on your muscle to stimulate growth, you're better off slowing it down, maybe decreasing the weight a little bit and controlling it the whole way throughout the motion, and that's going to be a lot more effective. And then once you get down your form and your tempo, then we can add in the intensity and you can start pushing yourself closer to failure. If you've been training for a while and you've never actually failed an exercise, you're probably doing something wrong. And I don't just mean, oh, it's starting to burn, I need to stop. I mean, you're truly pushing yourself to where you can't do another rep without sacrificing form. Now, that doesn't mean that you should be failing at every single set of every exercise. That's a little bit overkill and it's going to be really taxing on your muscles and your nervous system, but you should be getting close to failure and maybe even hitting it sometimes just to make sure that you're pushing yourself hard enough to actually stimulate your muscles to grow. Number 5 is that you're actually training too much, because there is a limit to how much your body can recover from. So if you're trying to train glutes more than 2 days a week, either you're not going to be able to train with the intensity that you need to build muscle, or your body is not going to be able to recover from the workouts that you're doing. So if you really want to focus on glutes, You can train them 2 days a week instead of 1, but I wouldn't recommend any more than that to make sure that your body is able to recover from those training sessions. You also want to make sure that you have at least 2 days between every glute training session, again, just to make sure that your body can recover before you go into the next session. On top of training too frequently, you could also just be doing too many reps. So if your goal is to build muscle, there's no reason that you should be doing sets of 15 to 20 because muscle is built in those last few reps before you approach failure, where you're really pushing yourself. And if you're doing a set of 20, those first 15 reps are probably pretty easy. They're not creating a whole lot of tension and they're not doing a whole lot to stimulate muscle growth. All they're doing is causing excess damage to your muscle that's not paying off in hypertrophy. So you want to stay more in the 6 to 10 rep range, maybe up to 12, to make sure that you can use enough weight with enough intensity to actually stimulate muscle growth without causing a whole bunch of extra damage. So just to recap, if you want to grow your glutes, make sure that you are eating enough to fuel your body and limiting the amount of cardio that you're doing. Be sure to select effective exercises and have a structured workout plan, and then focus on your form and execution and take time to recover. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. If you have any questions or recommendations for future videos, you can leave them in the comments down below, and I will see you in the next one.